Woods around Briar Hollow had a silence that didn't feel natural, it pressed against the air like a secret trying to stay buried. Locals said that if you listened closely after midnight, you could hear a baby crying, though no one in town had given birth for decades. The sound came from the ridge, where fog clung low to the trees and even the birds refused to fly. It was there, 40 years ago, that a midwife named Clara Jenkins delivered a child who was never supposed to exist. The mother, a pale girl no older than 16, had stumbled out of the forest half-conscious, her belly swollen and eyes glazed with something between madness and fear. When the baby came, the midwife's hands froze. It wasn't the blood that frightened her, it was what she saw inside the newborn's body. The baby's abdomen moved, faintly, as if something inside her was already alive. The child was named Elsie. She did not cry. She simply stared at the midwife with gray, ancient eyes, as though she understood every whispered prayer of terror in that room. By morning, the young mother had vanished, leaving only a trail of blood that led back into the woods. The first sign that something unnatural had happened in Briar Hollow came one winter night when Dr. Samuel Hayes was roused from his bed by the frantic banging on his door. A farmer stood outside, drenched in rain, begging him to come quickly. His wife's niece had gone into labor out near the edge of the woods, and something about it didn't feel right. The doctor, who had delivered half the town's babies over 30 years, gathered his bag and followed the men through the dark, winding path that led to an old, sagging farmhouse that looked like it had been standing since before the Civil War. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of iron and damp wood. The girl lay on a bed of old quilts, her face pale, her lips trembling, her eyes unfocused as if she wasn't really there. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her belly, swollen and taut, rose and fell with shallow breaths that came too fast. Her aunt hovered nearby, praying under her breath, whispering a name over and over that the doctor didn't recognize. When the child came, the room fell silent. The rain outside had stopped. Even the wind seemed to die in that moment. Dr. Hayes looked down at the infant and felt his breath catch. She was small, frail, with skin almost translucent, veins like threads of blue glass beneath the surface. But what made him drop his forceps wasn't her fragility, it was movement, subtle but undeniable, beneath her abdomen. At first, he thought it was muscle twitching, a reflex from the birth. But when he pressed his ear closer, he heard it, a second heartbeat. Not her own. The child wasn't crying, only staring up at him with eyes that seemed too steady, too aware. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, but the sight of that slow, pulsing movement under her skin haunted him. The girl who had given birth died before sunrise, her body cold and stiff by morning. The family didn't allow an autopsy. They buried her behind the house, near the tree line, without a preacher. The baby, whom they named Elsie, was taken away by the grandmother, an old woman who lived alone deep in the forest where no road reached. Dr. Hayes tried to speak about it once, years later, but the words caught in his throat every time he remembered that sound, that second heartbeat echoing inside a newborn chest. He eventually stopped mentioning it at all, and the story faded into the same silence that ruled the woods. But sometimes, on sleepless nights, he swore he could still hear it, faint and rhythmic, like something waiting to be born again. As Elsie grew older, the town began to whisper about the family that kept to themselves beyond the ridge, deep in the twisted heart of the forest. No one had seen them clearly in years, but their name still carried through the air like a curse, Holloway. It was said that generations of them had lived and died out there, never mixing with the town folk, never attending church, never letting their children attend school. Hunters who wandered too far sometimes caught sight of their house, a crooked cabin swallowed by vines, its windows black with grime, smoke rising only at dusk. They spoke of strange noises at night, of laughter that didn't sound quite human, and of shapes moving just beyond the glow of their lanterns. Every story led back to the same unsettling truth: the Holloways didn't need the outside world, and the outside world didn't dare need them. When Elsie's grandmother brought her home from the farmhouse that stormy night, no one in town saw the child again. But some said they heard crying echoing through the woods on moonless nights, soft and drawn out, as if from more than one voice. The few who went looking never came back the same. They spoke of bones hanging from branches, of jars filled with cloudy liquid sitting on windowsills, and of a single word carved into the trees surrounding the Holloway property, *Bloodline*. The sheriff once tried to investigate after a string of missing livestock, but when he returned, his hand shook too badly to hold a pen, and his report was left unfinished. Over time, Briar Hollow learned to stay quiet. Children were told never to wander near the woods. Outsiders who came asking questions about the Holloway girl were met with blank stares or closed doors. Yet the older folks, the ones who still remembered the night Elsie was born, spoke in low tones about the curse that ran through that family, how they had turned their bloodline inward for generations, binding themselves tighter and tighter until the line itself began to rot. They said that every Holloway child was a little stranger than the last, that their eyes held too much knowing, and their faces looked too familiar, as if all of them were reflections of the same person. The forest became a boundary between what was human and what wasn't meant to be. And somewhere beyond those trees, Elsie was growing, untouched by the outside world, carrying inside her something that would one day make even the bravest men in Briar Hollow wish he had never heard her name. 2 weeks after Elsie's birth, the midwife who had delivered her vanished without a trace. Clara Jenkins had lived her entire life in Briar Hollow, known for her steady hands and her refusal to believe in superstition. But something changed in her after that night. Neighbors noticed how she stopped smiling, how she no longer lingered to chat in the market, how her eyes darted toward the woods whenever someone mentioned the Holloways. She began locking her doors before sunset, drawing the curtains tight, and burning sage by her window until the whole house smelled of smoke and fear. People whispered that she had seen something during the birth that broke her, though no one dared ask her what it was. A few days before she disappeared, Clara visited the local church at dawn and asked the pastor to bless her house. She brought with her a small wooden box wrapped in cloth, insisting it be buried under the altar. The pastor, puzzled but sympathetic, agreed, though later he would swear the box trembled faintly when he held it. That night, the sound of knocking was heard from Clara's home. It wasn't the firm, deliberate kind that a person makes, it was frantic, uneven, almost animal. A neighbor claimed she heard Clara speaking to someone outside her door, her voice trembling, saying over and over, "You're not supposed to be here, you're not supposed to be alive." By morning, her door was wide open, her bed unmade, and her shoes still by the front step. She was gone. When the sheriff searched her house, he found no signs of a struggle, but on her kitchen table lay a single candle burned all the way down to wax and a notebook open to its final page. The handwriting was shaky, smeared with something dark, but one line stood out clearly among the chaos of half-written prayers, *, she's not a child. She's a continuation. * hidden beneath the notebook was a bundle of letters tied with twine, entries from Clara's diary. They spoke of strange dreams, of feeling watched even inside her home, and of hearing soft crying through the walls though she lived alone. Her last entry was dated the night before she vanished. It read, *, I saw her again in the mirror. She's bigger now. She smiled at me. *. The diary was locked away in the sheriff's office, but a few weeks later, it too went missing. The case was marked unresolved, and Clara Jenkins became another ghost story Briar Hollow told to keep its children from wandering too close to the trees. As Elsie grew, it became clear she was not like other children. Those few who caught glimpses of her said she moved too quietly for her age, her footsteps barely stirring the leaves beneath her feet. Her face was pale, her eyes gray and deep like river stones, and though her voice was soft, there was something about it that made people uneasy. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried a weight that felt far too old for her small body. Her grandmother, who kept her hidden from the town, sometimes brought her to the edge of the woods at dawn to fetch water from the creek. Farmers working nearby would stop and stare, struck by the way the child seemed to study everything, the birds, the current, the wind, with a calmness that didn't belong to a child at all. She never smiled, never cried, and never once appeared afraid. Rumors began to spread that Elsie could predict things. One man claimed that she told him his cow would die before the next storm, and the next day it did. Another swore she looked at him once and whispered his wife's name even though she'd been buried for years. Most dismissed these as drunken tales, but there were too many of them to ignore. The townsfolk started leaving offerings, flowers, bread, sometimes coins, at the path leading into the woods, hoping to appease whatever strange power the girl carried in her blood. The older folks said it wasn't power, but memory, that she carried inside her the voices of everyone who came before her, that every generation of Holloway blood spoke through her eyes. Her grandmother kept her busy with old rituals, burning herbs, marking symbols on the doorframes, and reciting words in a language no one else in town understood. Some nights, lights could be seen flickering deep in the forest, pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat under the trees. Hunters who wandered too close spoke of hearing two voices whispering in the dark, one belonging to an old woman, the other unmistakably that of a young girl. But what unsettled them most was that the two voices always spoke the same words in perfect unison. When she turned 6, a local doctor was called out to treat her grandmother for a fever. He later said that when he entered the cabin, Elsie was sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. She didn't blink once the entire time he was there. And when he packed his bag to leave, she turned her head slowly and said, "You shouldn't have come here. The woods don't forget." He never returned to that part of Briar Hollow again. When Elsie was around 8 years old, a schoolteacher from a nearby town, Miss Lillian Moore, decided to take it upon herself to bring education to the children living beyond Briar Hollow. She had heard whispers of a young girl hidden away deep in the forest, a child who had never seen a classroom or held a book. Lillian believed the stories were little more than rural exaggeration, born from fear and ignorance, so she convinced the sheriff to show her the trail that led toward the Holloway property. Against his better judgment, he pointed her to the old creek road and warned her not to stay after dark. She laughed off his concern, packed her satchel with chalk, paper, and a small Bible, and started toward the woods one misty morning in early autumn. The path grew colder and quieter the deeper she went. The trees stood close together, their branches weaving above her head like a cage. When she finally reached the cabin, the air felt wrong, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The grandmother opened the door before Lillian could knock, her face gaunt and unreadable, eyes too sharp for her frail frame. Without a word, she let her in. The smell inside was strange, sweet, metallic, and burnt. Lillian's gaze found Elsie sitting by the window, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes fixed on something outside that no one else could see. Lillian spoke kindly to the girl, showing her books and pictures, but Elsie didn't respond. She only lifted her head slowly, meeting the teacher's eyes with that same unsettling stillness. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "You shouldn't try to change what's already decided." The grandmother's hand shot out and gripped the teacher's arm, pulling her back. That touch was enough to make Lillian's body go cold. She left soon after, pretending not to notice the symbols carved into the wooden beams, or the sound of dripping coming from the floorboards even though she saw no water. That night, she woke to the faint sound of a child's laughter outside her window. It was soft at first, but it grew sharper, closer, until it seemed to come from inside the room. The next morning, her students found her sitting at her desk in the schoolhouse, pale and shaking, her eyes staring at nothing. She refused to speak of what had happened, packed her belongings that same afternoon, and left Briar Hollow without saying goodbye. Years later, a letter she wrote to a friend surfaced, though it was never mailed. In it, she confessed that she couldn't sleep without hearing that same laughter, and that sometimes, in the dark, she swore she could still feel small, cold fingers brushing against her throat. After the schoolteacher's disappearance from Briar Hollow, the townspeople's unease deepened into something darker, fear mixed with resignation. Rumors about the Holloway family had always drifted through the valley, but now even the authorities began to sense that something wasn't right. The new sheriff, a pragmatic man named Walter Briggs, decided to open an official investigation into the Holloways after receiving multiple reports of missing livestock, strange noises, and a lingering fog that seemed to hang perpetually over the ridge. He requested the family's records from the county archives, birth certificates, marriage licenses, land deeds, but when the documents arrived, half of them were missing. The clerk swore they had been there just the week before. The remaining papers were old and fragile, the ink fading into illegibility, and several names had been scratched out completely as if someone had tried to erase the lineage itself. Briggs sent a deputy into the woods to locate the Holloway property. The men returned 2 days later, pale and trembling, insisting there was no cabin, only the remains of a foundation overgrown with moss and black vines. He claimed to have found children's toys buried in the dirt, hand-carved dolls with faces that looked disturbingly similar to each other. When the sheriff pressed him for more details, the deputy broke down, muttering that he had seen someone watching him from between the trees, a figure small and still with eyes that glinted like glass. Briggs tried to dismiss it as nerves, but the next morning the deputy was gone, his uniform neatly folded by the station door, his boots still muddy from the forest floor. The sheriff pushed forward, determined to get answers, but the harder he tried, the more the trail dissolved. Newspaper clippings about the Holloways vanished from the archives. Photographs that once included them now showed only empty fields or blurred outlines. Even witness testimonies changed when revisited. People who had sworn to have seen Elsie now claimed they didn't remember her at all. It was as if the family was slowly being erased, not just from the present, but from memory itself. Briggs began keeping notes in a locked drawer, but one morning he found the pages blank. Only the indentation of his handwriting remained, as though the ink had been pulled from the paper. That night, he dreamed of a girl standing in his yard, her gray eyes fixed on his window. When he awoke, his front door was open, and his dog was gone. By dawn, the sheriff submitted his resignation without explanation and left town before sunrise. The investigation file was quietly closed, marked unsolved, and the Holloway name was never spoken aloud in Briar Hollow again. Years passed, and the Holloway story turned into something between a warning and a dare among the younger generation. By the time the old sheriff's notes had turned yellow with dust, a group of college students from a nearby university decided to turn the legend into a documentary project. They had heard the stories, the cursed bloodline, the missing midwife, the erased records, and thought it would make the perfect subject for their folklore class. There were 5 of them in total, 2 film students, a history major, and a couple who called themselves amateur paranormal investigators. None of them truly believed the tale. To them, Briar Hollow was just another dying town clinging to its ghosts. They arrived in late autumn, when the air was sharp and the trees were stripped bare, and rented a small cabin near the edge of the woods. The locals refused to talk, but their silence only fueled the students' curiosity. On the first day, they interviewed townsfolk outside the general store, recording shaky soundbites of old men warning them to stay away from the ridge. One woman, her eyes cloudy with age, told them the woods didn't like to be disturbed, that the Holloways still breathe in there. The students laughed it off, but that night, as they reviewed the footage, one of them noticed something odd in the background of a shot, a figure standing between 2 trees, small, motionless, barely visible through the fog. They rewound it several times, convinced it was a trick of the light, but each time, the figure remained, head tilted, watching. Determined to find the ruins of the old Holloway cabin, they set out the next morning armed with cameras, flashlights, and maps drawn from local archives. The forest swallowed them quickly. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until even their footsteps seemed muffled. After hours of walking, they stumbled upon a clearing where the trees grew in a perfect circle. In the center was the outline of a house's foundation, half buried in dirt and roots. Scattered around it were shards of glass, broken jars, and pieces of old furniture. One of them found a rusted baby cradle, its wood carved with initials too faded to read. When they set up their equipment, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faintest sound, something between a sigh and a whisper. One of the students swore she heard her own name being spoken, soft and close, though no one stood near her. They tried to laugh it off, but the forest around them felt alive, as if the air itself was listening. By dusk, they packed up and started back, but when they looked behind them, there were 6 sets of footprints in the mud. When the students returned to the clearing the next day, the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the forest had been waiting for them. They followed the same path as before, guided by the GPS coordinates they had saved, but something was different. The trees looked closer together, the air thicker. The birds that had called faintly the day before were gone, and every sound they made seemed to echo unnaturally far. When they reached the site, they realized the foundation they had seen yesterday was now deeper, sunken into the earth as if the ground had swallowed part of it overnight. One of them, Aaron, began digging near the edges, determined to find proof of human habitation. After several minutes, his shovel hit something solid, a wooden box, waterlogged and old. Inside were journals wrapped in waxed cloth, the pages brittle but legible enough to read. Each book was filled with the same name written repeatedly across different entries, the mother of all bloodlines. The handwriting shifted in style and tone as if multiple generations had added to the same collection. There were entries describing births that should not have been possible, children who came too soon or not at all, and ceremonies held under new moons that bound the family to some promise older than memory. The words grew more frantic with each generation, referring to the vessel, the continuation, and the unborn within. The final entry, smeared and barely readable, spoke of a child, born twice, carrying the seed of the first within her. As they explored further, one of the film students found a door beneath the debris, a trapdoor leading into a small underground room. The stench that rose when they opened it was unbearable, thick with rot and mildew. Inside were shelves lined with glass jars, each one containing something suspended in murky fluid. They shone their lights closer and saw that the jars held fetuses, all with eerily similar features, high cheekbones, narrow faces, and grayish eyes that seemed to stare even through the glass. Some jars were cracked, leaking onto the dirt floor, and among them was a single, larger container filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Scratched into its surface were the words asterisk, "She carries us still." Asterisk. They filmed everything, their hands shaking, their voices low. One of the students wanted to leave immediately, but Aaron insisted they stay until they had captured everything. As they packed up to go, the camera's audio picked up a faint heartbeat that none of them noticed at the time. When they played the footage back that night, the sound grew louder, steady, and rhythmic, as though coming from beneath the ground itself. Then, just before the recording ended, a whisper broke through the static, soft, female, and unmistakable, "Don't take what's mine." The students left the woods shaken but triumphant, convinced they had uncovered the darkest secret Briar Hollow had ever kept. They returned to their rented cabin, replaying the footage over and over, trying to make sense of the whispers and the heartbeat. As night fell, the air grew thick with tension. The group sat huddled around a single lamp while rain began tapping at the windows. It was then that Aaron started to feel sick. At first, he thought it was exhaustion, the nausea, the chills, the dizziness, but when he lifted his shirt to wipe the sweat from his face, one of the others gasped. His abdomen was swollen, faintly moving beneath the skin as though something inside him was pushing outward. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a muscle spasm, but when he pressed his palm against it, he felt a pulse. Not his own, but something deeper, slower. The group panicked. They packed up to leave that night, but the storm had washed out the only road leading back to town. The rain hammered the roof while the lights flickered, and each time the thunder rolled, they swore they heard faint crying mixed within the wind. Aaron's condition worsened quickly. He began muttering words none of them understood, phrases that matched the ones they'd read in the old journals. When they tried to take him to bed, he screamed, not from pain, but from a voice he said was whispering to him from inside his stomach. "She's not gone," he said. "She's coming through me." By midnight, the heartbeat they'd captured in their recording began to play on its own, echoing from the laptop even after it was shut. The sound filled the cabin, steady, deliberate, and close. One of the students smashed the device in terror, but the noise didn't stop. It seemed to come from the walls, from the floorboards, from beneath their feet. Aaron collapsed then, his breathing shallow, eyes wide and glassy. The movement beneath his skin grew frantic, rippling like something clawing its way toward the surface. Blood began seeping through his shirt, not from a wound, but from tiny fissures forming along his stomach as if his body were being torn from within. When dawn broke, the storm had cleared. The cabin was silent, the camera still recording on its side. The footage later found on it showed 4 empty chairs, overturned equipment, and blood leading toward the door. Aaron was gone, leaving behind only his clothes and a smear of handprints on the wall. The last seconds of the video caught a faint reflection in the window, a small, pale face watching from outside, gray eyes staring straight into the lens. By the time the authorities arrived at the cabin, the students' equipment was scattered across the floor, the footage corrupted beyond repair except for fragments filled with static and faint, rhythmic sounds. The investigators dismissed the case as hysteria and exposure, claiming the missing members had likely fled or gotten lost in the woods, but those who handled the evidence couldn't shake the sense that something had followed them home. The townsfolk whispered that what happened to Aaron and his friends wasn't an accident, that they had disturbed a cycle that was never meant to be broken. Deep in those hills, bloodlines didn't end, they folded in on themselves, and the Holloway name was the thread that tied it all together. Elsie, the girl born pregnant, had not been an anomaly of nature but the product of generations perfecting something unnatural, something meant to preserve their lineage beyond the laws of flesh. The journals found beneath the cabin hinted at a ritual, a process of inheritance that was neither birth nor rebirth but continuation. It wasn't about one body carrying another, it was about the essence of their blood moving forward through hosts, each generation acting as both vessel and seed. Elsie had been born not as a child but as a container, carrying within her the living remains of the one before her. When she grew, that life would awaken, and through her, it would begin again. There were no fathers, no outsiders, only replication through the same line, the same faces, the same heartbeat repeating through time. The phrase, the mother of all bloodlines, wasn't symbolic, it was literal. She was the mother, daughter, and grandchild of herself, a loop that never ended. The student's intrusion had broken the stillness that kept that curse contained. Whatever had been sleeping beneath the earth had recognized the presence of new blood, new vessels, and reached for them. The heartbeat on the recording wasn't an echo, it was a call, a summoning of the next generation. When the investigators sealed off the site, they reported hearing faint tapping beneath the ground, as though something alive still moved down there. Days later, one of the officers was found dead in his home, his face pale, his abdomen swollen, and his mouth smeared with blood. There were no signs of struggle, only a single phrase written on the wall in his own handwriting, "She's awake." After that, the town stopped sending people into the woods. The land was marked as private, the path overgrown and forgotten. But sometimes, travelers passing through Briar Hollow claimed to see a little girl near the ridge, her dress white and her eyes the color of storm clouds, standing still as if waiting for someone to come closer, listening for the next heartbeat.